Cinematic gameplay is a divisive term. It evokes a reaction from two types of people: those who are opposed to the idea, and those who are wrong. I'm kidding. Maybe just a little. Maybe I'm not. Hark Vagrant. I'll be your projectionist this evening. Pokey. Don't worry, this video will run at a non-threatening 30 FPS, 60 FOV. As a preface to what I'm about to be going over in this video, I'm not implying that if you happen to like the design choices I discuss here, then you should stop. We all derive fun and pleasure in different ways, so I would by no means tell you that you're experiencing your fun the wrong way. Yes, that intro was a joke, which I'm certain will net me a Bancroft Prize. This is merely my observation of cinematic game design and my opinion of it. It's not like that there aren't games that I love that haven't been hit with the filmic stick, with a few recycled stock palettes used ad nauseum to emulate a filmic experience. Some people have begun to feel as if they have been relegated to spectators rather than participants. Countless examples can be listed of games with a cinematic presentation that didn't feel the urge to take the controller out of our hands. Despite this, many developers, especially those of the AAA persuasion, have opted for the path of least resistance. I mean, easy money is tempting to chase, especially when it runs in only one direction. And while everyone throws a fit over a game's native resolution on consoles, devs have been able to get away without optimizing their frame rates. Some developers are downright bitter that they're developing a game. They're so upset that they aren't filming a movie that they actively take measures to neuter their game in lieu for a filmic experience. The first thing that most people associate with these types of games are QuickTime events. And it makes sense. Some shitbird suddenly comes up to you and takes the controller out of your hand. You'll remember that. Obviously, a player desires more interaction with the game's world. In an effort to resolve this, we were given QuickTime events. Then, in quite the display of failure, they've actually decreased our capability to interact with said world. Look, when you take control out of the hands of the player and then you begin to automate the actors on screen to take over, and then you paste these tacky-looking, immersion-breaking button prompts all about, you have not created gameplay. Instead, you've created cutscenes that task the participant with ensuring that they come to an end. Likewise, I'm sure no one is looking forward to a film that stops or rewinds itself to encourage viewer interaction. Now, I've probably given you the impression that I hate QTE so much that playing one would trigger me into a weeping pile of pronouns. That's simply not true. I could think of several games with QTEs that I, in fact, love. Now, let's deduct the games in which I felt that the QTEs remained a bad component in an otherwise fantastic game. So in these three, I actually enjoyed the QuickTime events. Now, let's see. Which ones would I like to see their QTEs return? Call me old-fashioned, but once the game starts to take control of itself, I want to relax and watch the carefully choreographed scene unfold, not begrudgingly play a spontaneous round of Bop It. Of course, I can make a few exceptions for QuickTime events. If it's an optional execution prompt, I'm okay with this. Likewise, I have witnessed a few clever implementations of QuickTime events. They're scarce, but they exist. And credit to Konami for letting people switch Lords of Shadow 2's QuickTime events off in the options. That should have been a trendsetter. Arguably less intrusive, yet just as unwelcomed are the dreaded unskippable cutscenes. I find it hard to believe that this is anything but a consciously made choice by the development team's director. Never mind the fact that by not utilizing the strengths of the medium, neglecting a cutscene skip feature disrespects the time of the player, but it also slows down the pace of the game to a crawl. For action-oriented games, especially beat-em-ups, it serves solely as a buzzkill. Even if the game is not combat-centric, you're axing a strength of the medium that would otherwise encourage repeated playthroughs. Speaking personally, I always watch all cutscenes and listen to all direct and ambient dialogue on my first playthrough of a game. Why is it not taken into consideration that when I go through for a second time, I won't want to hear it all again? Are you afraid I'll miss something? Is that not what theater mode is made for? Mandatory walk and talk segments aren't any better. I'm glad I can control my character and all, but it serves no purpose if I'm being told I can't progress until whatever ambient dialogue is going off comes to a complete stop. If they wanted walk and talk to erase unnecessary cutscenes or replace them entirely, wouldn't it have been wiser to let me progress as fast as I please while my character converses? You've already taken the baby step of putting control back in my hand. Why not take the strides forward to truly fuse dialogue scenes with gameplay? I may not like Borderlands much, but that's one touch I can give them credit for. And won't someone think of the speedrunners? Anyone? The worst offenders, however, are the devs who make sacrifices to gameplay which hinder the player's ability to efficiently play the game. Or, as I like to call it, awful idea developer syndrome. These same developers will deflect concerns and criticisms about their inability to make a game run well with excuses about how they wanted to create a specific experience, such as stuffing the screen full of actors. Or how about the classic, No, the genre of game doesn't need it, unlike that other genre, said those who are developing games with action combat and or shooting mechanics. Some development teams are flat out bitter that they're even making a video game to begin with. They would prefer to be filming a movie, and so their project suffers. One of the most recent examples of this is the Order 1886. Ready at Dawn Studios has expressed what could almost be read as contempt for making video games. They argued that 30 FPS gives the game a cinematic feel, and that 60 FPS ruin the aesthetic. Oh, you mean like how those QTE prompts ruin the aesthetic, right? Or how about that intrusive letterbox? Non-optional motion blur? Shaky cam? Grays and browns. Gee, if you ask me, Ready at Dawn, you didn't have much of an aesthetic to be concerned about to begin with. It also doesn't work in the developer's favor when they try to regurgitate PR talk by telling us that a game will run at 30 frames yet feel like 60. Because that's not how it works. It's a fact that frame rate directly impacts the response time of a game reading your inputs. 60 is the reasonable minimum number of frames because it's simply proven to work as intended. And no matter how skill-based a game is, whether if it's Devil May Cry or Devil May Cry, your dodge needs to work without delay, as well as the rest of your combat kit. Is that to say that I would never play a game below 60 FPS? Or even 30? No. One of my all-time favorite games is riddled with frame rate issues. Dark Souls. And that's not the only game I cherish with an awful frame rate. In fact, some games are even recommended to be played at 30 for health issues, at the risk of being crucified for pointing out the black spots on the sacred cow. The Last of Us is one among these. Again, in lieu for cinematic presentation, the camera in The Last of Us is pulled in tight, with a claustrophobic field of view. When played at 30 frames, it's barely noticeable. However, when the remaster was released for the PS4, people began to complain about motion sickness. This was a result of turning on the 60 FPS mode. They were experiencing the same thing that others have when they play a first-person shooter at 60 frames with an irreversibly strict field of view. Growing physically ill, endangering their health, it was no longer an option for them to play the game at a smooth 60, but instead had to return to 30 frames. Now, there's two ways that this could have been fixed. Either they could have put the option in for a field of view slider, or they could have opted to pull out the camera and widen the lens themselves to begin with. And really, for a game with such a beautiful, detailed world, why not allow us to soak in the scenery with a wider lens, rather than implement a gimmicky studio screenshot feature? Or, fuck it, both. Why not? And hey, I mean, while The Last of Us suffers from this poor design choice, it's not alone in its camera dickery. Despite how Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Shadow of the Colossus, and Zone of the Enders were able to pull off unique camera styles to cinematically express the tone of their games, others failed to see how they made it work. Again, with poor field of view, the camera of some games would be so far up your character's ass that you were a few inches away from playing a colon exploration simulator. Other times, they'll come up with an interesting camera idea, but the execution would be abysmal. And in the case of Kane and Lynch 2, it was thankfully optional. Also, why the hell is letterboxing now becoming a thing? Back when RE4 released, it added nothing and was one of the few things I disliked about an otherwise phenomenal game. All this serves to do is reduce my visibility, giving me an inexplicable handicap that obfuscates my vision. Even worse, the game's internal resolution does not scale to fit within the bars. I understand that it's an aesthetic choice, but it's also a poor design decision to force onto the player. I understand developers have a vision for their game, but sacrificing practicality to achieve a cinematic feel for your game makes the designer look bad, and the player feel frustrated. Makes me wonder why most of these design choices couldn't come packaged with options to switch them on or off to begin with. That's not the PC player in me talking, that's just some common courtesy. Herein lies the issue. The implication that games even need to be more like films to begin with. It was once a noble goal for the sake of immersion, born of the zeitgeist of the games industry. Genres such as RPGs, point-and-clicks, cinematic platformers, and survival horror games helped to push us, breaking new ground and propelling us forward in the right, albeit misguided direction. By the 5th generation, so many strides had been made for the sake of immersive, cinematic experience that even 3D platformers, adventure games, and the stealth genre brought us closer to our goals. That being said though, that doesn't mean that we couldn't go too far, which we have. A number of 6th generation masterpieces accomplished giving the player a cinematic experience. However, despite them reaching critical acclaim, there were others that had as well that used cheaper, creatively bankrupt mechanics. For the record, I'm not implying that a QTE sequence is cheaper in cost, nor that it requires a deficiency in imagination to pull off. What I am saying is that the experience that it's trying to convey, that of an interactive movie, is underwhelming, overdone, and fails to achieve what it even sought out to do. This is why that I feel that our journey towards making games feel more like movies has been misguided. Because honestly, it's an insult to both film and games to say that one should strive to be more like the other. They're two entirely separate forms of media. They must be written differently, conveyed differently, they're consumed differently, and both have their own strengths that keep the two industries alive. This is why when I see devs speaking of how they feel that their title will come a little closer to closing the gap a little more tightly between film and game, I can't take them seriously as a game designer. Again, there are a number of games I absolutely love that share these qualities that I just spoke about, and even some of them that pull them off better than others. All I can really ask is that the developers out there rethink their design choices. I know I'm not the only one who is frustrated with them and feels like the industry has gone stagnant. Although, what is interesting is that these filmic experiences are, more often than not, AAA games. Given that AAA is the new standard for trash, this speaks volumes about the upper echelon of the industry. But to get into that would have to be an entirely separate video. Well, I hope you enjoyed counting the amount of times I said the phrase QuickTime event. Twitters, Facey Space, oh bye bye.
Everything, but you don't know anything.